Emboss Resist is one of my favourite techniques to use in card making, and I've combined it with the new release from Catherine Pooler Designs, Jolly Holidays, to create 4 fun, colourful cards to send out this season. It's Verity here at my YouTube channel and blog Pretty Little Button, where I make paper crafting tutorials for the everyday crafter. So for this card I'm using the Caroling Sentiments stamp set from Catherine Pooler Designs, which has 4 big stamps that have a variety of different sentiments in the shape of a Christmas object. So for this first card I'm going to create a heat emboss background using the Row of Trees stamp from the set. And I've placed some green card in my Misty stamping platform, and then I'm positioning the row of trees at the top of the card, just picking that up with my Misty door. So I'm going to heat emboss these, so I'm using my Wow Clear Ultra Slow Drying Embossing Pad, and I've just prepped the card stock beforehand just to make sure I haven't transferred any of my sticky fingerprints to the card. Once I've inked up my stamp, I'm closing my Misty stamping platform and pressing it down. Now, my ink pad is a little bit dry and I did need to go and re-ink it, but because it's a little bit dry, I'm just re-inking the stamp again and then pressing it down a couple of times just to get a really good coverage of ink. Once I've stamped this first line, I'm then going to move my piece of card up. So I've moved it up just over 2 squares and then I'm moving it in within 2 squares because I want to change the position of the trees on the card so it has a little bit of variation. Now I close my Misty door just to make sure that it's lined up correctly, and I slightly had to move up just a little bit so my stamping didn't overlap. So once more I just ink up this stamp and stamp it down, and I keep repeating this continuously along the card until the whole card is full. Once I completely stamped the whole card, I'm then heat embossing this in metallic rich gold embossing powder from Wow Embossing Powder. Now I use my dual speed heat gun to heat set this. I'm using it on setting 2, so this will give you the heat and the speed to ensure it reduces the warping. I do warm it up off screen just to get it up to temperature before I bring it to card, just again reduce the amount of warping it will cause to the card. Now obviously this row of trees didn't completely fill the whole width of the card. So to complete the card and the background, I've just placed the whole card on some fun foam on my mat, just to give it a bit of resistance and help to get a good impression when I stamp down using an acrylic block. And I'm just stamping this along the edges until all of those gaps are completely filled, using my Clear Ultra Slow Drying Embossing Pad from Wow to do so. Once all of the areas were stamped, I'm covering it again in the metallic gold rich embossing powder and heat setting, so I have a completely full background full of trees. Okay, so to do the Emboss Resist with this background, I'm using a selection of Catherine Pooler inks, and I'm first of all starting off with a lighter colour, which is Eucalyptus. I'm going to ink blend around the edge of the cardstock, making it darker on the outside and leaving a small amount of the coloured cardstock still visible in the inner part of the card, just to give like a halo effect around my final design at the end. So the colour I'm using here is Eucalyptus, and I'm going in with a round ink blending tool to add ink to the edges of the card, and I'm just using circular motions to bring the ink down and in towards the middle of the card. Once I've gone round with the lightest colour and I've brought that quite far into the middle of the card, I'm then going in with my next colour, which is Spruce, going around the edge of the card and just adding it and bringing it in a little bit less into the middle compared to the Eucalyptus. To get a smooth blend between the colours, I do go back in between, so I go back to my Eucalyptus and blend between Spruce. And then lastly, I use the new colour from Catherine Pooler Design, which is Deck the Hall. So this is a lovely dark evergreen green, and it really adds a lot of depth and interest to the edge of the card, making it a little bit more dramatic. Now, as I said, this is using Emboss Resist, so obviously the embossing powder is going to resist this ink as I add it on. Now, there will be a little bit of colour sitting on the embossing ink, but because of the nature of the embossing powder, I can use a clean cloth just to wipe it off and brighten up the embossing powder once more, and you'll see that lovely gold shine. Okay, so for this second background, I am using a lot of the small little stamps that come in the stamp set. So I wanted to show you how to create a background, stretching the stamp set more so. These stamps include the pair of mittens, so there's several different designs of mittens, some snowflakes, some stars, and some little dots. Now I'm starting off with the biggest, smallest stamp out of the set, so this is the snowflake. And I'm not using a messy or a stamping platform. Instead, I'm just placing the cardstock on a piece of fun foam and using my acrylic blocks to stamp these. So the fun foam helps give it a little bit of resistance when you're stamping and gives a really good impression. So I start off with the biggest stamp because obviously if you start off with the small ones and fill it quite a lot, you won't have much space for the bigger stamps. So I'm placing this onto the card and I'm kind of creating triangles from all the stamp positions that I stamp with that snowflake. Now I've done this on a blue cardstock, so I'm going to create a blue themed card, but I'm going to use white embossing powder. So this is Wow Opaque Bright White Embossing Powder, and I'm covering what I've already stamped so far just to make it a little bit easier to see where I have stamped, but I'm not actually going to heat set it yet. So then I'm moving on to some of the smaller stamps. So these are the pair of mittens, and as I say, there's several different designs of pair of mittens, so they're quite cute. And I'm stamping these around the cardstock and around those snowflakes. Then I go into a stamp the stars. So there's a couple of different size stars, the large star and the small star. And I use the small stars and there's some little dots within the design to fill in the small areas. And this will really finish and make your background complete when you use smaller items like that to fill in the areas that are a little bit blank. So again, I've then covered the remainder of the stamping in the Opaque Bright White embossing powder and I'm heat setting. And as I said, this gives a really lovely contrast between the ink blending we're going to do later and the embossing powder, because the embossing powder is lovely and opaque and bright, as the name says. So for this card, I'm using a selection of blue inks. So I'm starting off with Stone Blue ink from Catherine Pooler Designs. I'm just starting at the bottom and I'm bringing this 2/3 of the way up the card, and I'm using the ink blending tool once more. This colour will soften out into the blue of the cardstock. So that's why I'm leaving a little bit at the top. Once I've added enough of the light blue, I'm then adding Suede Shoes Catherine Pooler ink. I bring that up about 1/3 to halfway up the card, and then the last colour I add to the bottom to darken it off and add a little bit more drama is Juniper Mist. Now again, as with the card before, I do go back between the colours using this blending sponge and tool just to blend between the colours to get that lovely soft transition. As with gold embossing powder, the white embossing powder also resists the ink, and I'm using my dry cloth to brush off and clean off the ink that sits on top of the white embossing powder. Now I'm doing this a lot more frequently because it will slightly change the colour of the white ever so slightly. It will dull it a little bit, especially if you add all the ink and then clean it at the end. So with white embossing powder, I tend to clean the embossing powder each time I change colour. Okay, so for this one, I'm using one of the longer stamps from the Caroling Sentiment stamp set, using the row of presents. Now, just to make it a little bit more different, and also so you don't notice if I've gone off centre or I'm a little bit wonky, I'm stamping these presents at an angle, so diagonally across the card panel. So I've got a red piece of cardstock, 5.5 by 4.25, and I'm using a long thin acrylic block to stamp the presents at a diagonal, and I'm making sure that I change the position of the stamps as well along the diagonal so that they're not completely matchy really. And I stamp this all the way up the card. As I go, I do cover it with embossing powder without heat setting it, just so I can see where I have stamped. And then once the whole background is completely stamped, I'm then using my dual speed heat gun to heat set it. Now for this background, I have covered it in metallic copper embossing powder, and this pairs really lovely with the red background of the cardstock, but also the red colours I'm going to ink blend over the top. So for this card, I am using, first of all, Rouge Catherine Paula ink, and I'm blending this diagonally to match the diagonal embossing along and up towards one corner. Once I've brought that ink up about 2/3 of the way up the card, I'm then switching to peppermint scrub and then blending this about 1/3 of the way up the card, about halfway up the card. And then lastly, I'm finishing it off by using the new ink colour Cranberry Fizz from Catherine Buller Designs, a lovely rich deep red burgundy colour. This adds a little bit more of the drama down one corner of the card. Again, as before, because the embossing powder can resist that ink, I'm just cleaning it with a dry cloth just to brighten up the embossing powder. Okay, for the last card, I'm going to do some heat embossing, but I'm going to do it centred around a particular area, so the whole background won't be embossed. So this time, because I know I want to add a bauble to the front of this card, I'm just positioning the bauble die. That is a coordinating die set for the Caroling Sentiment stamp set. And I'm positioning this where I think it's going to go. And I'm going to emboss around that area. I'm going to use the stars from the stamp set to create like a twinkle atmosphere around the bauble, as you'd say. So I'm using a combination of the larger and smaller stars and also the small little stamp that has the 3 dots, just to add a bit more interest. Once I have then completely stamped the area, and again I'm going back in with that bauble die just to check that the embossing isn't going to be hidden by the bauble, that it does come out and it looks pretty. I'm then covering it in metallic platinum embossing powder from Wow. Then I heat set this with my dual speed heat gun again. This creates a really lovely pretty halo around the bauble that I will eventually put on the card, but doesn't completely fill the whole background. And I'm going to ink blend onto this, but I'm not going to completely ink blend over all of the embossing powder, so it's a bit more of a subtle emboss resist. So the first colour I'm going to add to this background is Sugared Lavender. So this is quite a pale, muted purple. Got a touch of pink, and as I add it to the card, it blends really, really well with the pink background. Now I'm adding the colour so it mimics the shape that I've created with the embossing, and it's going to be more darker in 3 corners compared to the top corner, just to mimic that sort of circle halo effect that I want around the bauble. After this, I'm then going in with Sangria ink, which is a lovely, more rich fuchsia, dark fuchsia purple. And once I'm happy with that blend going back between Sugar Lavender and Sangria, I'm then just darkening the edges up with Royal Treatment, which really adds a lot of drama to this background. Okay, so we've created all of the background, so let's add the focal stamping. So I'm using the coordinating dies that come with the Caroling Sentiment stamp set, and I've die cut the tree and bauble out of card, and I've kept the negative pieces of card because I'm going to use those to help align my stamping when I'm using my stamping platform. So I've placed the negative piece back into my Misty stamping platform, then placed the actual tree die cut within that, and that keeps it held in place. This also means that when I stamp, if I haven't got the greatest impression the first time round, I can then re-stamp it. Now to mimic sort of the backgrounds, I'm using the colours that I ink blended to create an ombre ink stamp of these sentiments. So for the tree, I used Eucalyptus at the top, then I added Spruce and then Deck the Halls at the bottom, and I'm just tapping my ink pad down, overlapping the colours slightly. So if we look here with the bauble, I started off with Sugared Lavender at the top, and this time, instead of adding all of the ink colours to the stamp, I'm now just stamping one colour at a time. So first of all, I added Sugared Lavender, and I just used a baby wipe just to soften the edges of where I had added the ink to the stamp. And then I'm going in with Sangria, and I'm making sure the colours overlap, and again using the baby wipe to soften the edges. Lastly, I go in with Royal Treatment at the bottom to finish the stamp off. So to finish these cards off, each of the die cut sentiments was foam mounted onto each of the card panels, And I added a selection of sequins from the Mistletoe Sequin Mix from Catherine Pooler Designs. Now for the blue card with the snowman, I just stuck to the silver sequins that were in the mix because the green and red don't quite go with the whole colour scheme of that card, but they pair perfectly with the present and tree card because of the reds and greens. Now for the bauble card, I didn't want to use the sequins because it didn't really go in with the colour scheme that I'd used on that card. And instead what I did was heat emboss some of the stars onto a white card and then die cut them using the coordinated dies. So I'm using the stamps in this respect to embellish the card and the bauble. Now to make the bauble look more authentic, I also added some gold twine, created a little bow and stuck that on the top of the bauble with some glue, and also added a bit of twine to the back of the bauble to then hang it onto the card. For links to the products used in today's video, you will find a list in the video description below, and also a full list will be over on my blog. If you enjoyed today's video, why not give it a thumbs up, and why not hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you'll be notified when my next video is up. Hopefully you've got some great inspiration to use Emboss Resist in your Christmas cards this year, and let me know in the comments below which is your favourite card out of the 4. Until next time, happy crafting!